I think they can hear me all right. We'll see if we can make this work. He asked if my voice was very loud, and I said, no, it doesn't carry very well either. So I'm glad we have a microphone. I'll certainly try to use that. I appreciate the opportunity to come. I hate that I get to come in this kind of circumstance with Kurt not being able to get here, but it's interesting. He asked me if I could come. He didn't tell me what he was talking about. He didn't tell me what setting we were going to be in. He didn't tell me anything but, can you go to Kentucky? So here I am. And so it's been kind of interesting to kind of see what we're doing here. And we do so many of our handling deals and live demonstrations. And when I saw this was all going to be classroom, I thought, Kurt's not going to have a presentation for that, because he never has a presentation for anything. And so I thought I'd just keep in that same vein. We'll just do it off a few notes. But I looked at what Kurt had put in the proceedings. He's got a little write-up there behind his bio talking about how things have changed in the grazing world because of human interference or interaction, I guess you could say, and how we've kind of stopped the natural cycle of things by fencing things in and trying to control where they graze. We've actually changed the dynamics of how animals normally behave. You know, in our large herds and roaming animals around, we've kind of changed all that, right? We started building highways and fences, we messed the whole thing up. So when we get into this scenario and trying to figure out how we can manage grazing to kind of mimic what Mother Nature used to do, that is really a challenging aspect of it. And before I get too deep into this, I want to see how many of y'all are cow-calf producers? Most of you are. Any of you running stocker cattle on top of that? Most of you cow-calf, okay. So are we retaining ownership in any of the calves that you keep back, or is it just some of you are retaining ownership and running them a little bit? I always ask people how many of them retain ownership. Very few people ever stick their hand up. Then you ask how many of them retain heifers, and 90% of you will stick your hand in there. That's retained ownership, by the way, folks. That's a stocker operation, by the way. And so I always get tickled thinking about the way in our mindset, that's something different than what would be bringing cattle in. And to some extent, it makes it a whole lot easier because you're not commingling and mixing different source cattle. So that was one thing I really wanted to kind of see who was in the room, kind of know how we talk about this, because it does change a little bit of how I approach it. But when you think about reducing stress, and the title is Reducing Livestock Stress and Grazing Systems, and they kept talking about livestock handling, those can be part of the same thing, but there's a lot of stressors in just the grazing systems we employ. And so I think we think about how we actually look at what we do and how we do it. What are the main stressors in a cow's life? Anybody ever thought about that? How many of them are human induced and how many of them environmentally induced? And I'm going to say most of the environmentally induced ones, humans have the responsibility of managing those stressors, whether it be heat, cold, whatever it might be. So when we fence them in, we take the responsibility of having all those management things to be concerned about. And so how we manage that and what we do with it, I think does make a difference. If we look, and I may take y'all a little deeper in some of this than you want to today, but there's a core principles of animal welfare, and a lot of people in the cattle business never want to talk about welfare because it conjures up bad images in some people's mind. But if we're not managing the welfare of the animals, we're not doing right by the animals. And there's a whole concept. Anybody ever heard of the 5 freedoms? Some of the academic world may have. There's actually a core set of principles that was developed years ago, probably for zoo animals more than anything else, talking about how they enrich that. But they kind of become the core system by which a lot of people look at how we manage livestock and manage stress. And a lot of people don't like the word freedoms anyway when you go talking about livestock. and I appreciate that. And they've kind of changed the name of it. We're going to talk about that as well. But the first one was freedom from hunger and thirst, right? That's a freedom. Every animal ought to have plenty to eat and drink. Anybody in here disagree with that? I don't want to call it a freedom, but that's our job, right, is to make sure they have plenty to eat, plenty to drink. In some grazing systems, I'm going to tell you, that don't always happen because we're so worried about forage management. Sometimes we limit the amount of forage access and quality forage access that we see in some grazing operations. I've gotten very involved with our Grazing Lands Coalition because they were actually not even talking about the animal side of it. It was all about the art of grazing, but it was totally focused on the forage. I think the forage is really important, but if we don't get the animal performance out of it, then I'm not sure why we're doing it. One, we got to pay the bills, part of that deal. The other one is one of these freedoms is freedom from discomfort. What in the world does that mean? That's a good question, right? But environmental issues may be part of that. Pain and suffering is another freedom that they actually put out there. Can we have cattle that are free of pain? Most of the time, but anybody ever castrated one of them? It gets a little dicey in some areas, right? So freedom from pain and discomfort may not be the best criteria we use. But as we do that, that's a stressor we have to deal with. And I will tell you right now, there's a lot of companies in the world where pain management is their biggest concern. And we're going to see that in our livestock industries. Europe, you have to control pain to dehorn or castrate. You have to give something to the animal. That's why a lot of countries don't castrate. That's the way they avoid pain management. With our quality beef system, we have to do that, or we don't get the quality beef we normally would. So there's a lot of reasons for that as well. The other one is express normal behavior. And this one I think about quite a bit, and most people think about, the chickens, they can stand up, flop their wings, get around in a cage, move around. But in cattle, when they're out in a pasture, can they express normal behavior? And for the most part, they can. But what is part of normal behavior in a grazing animal? It's diet selectivity. When we put them in a grazing system, we try to eliminate that normal behavior. So think about that. We use it as a tool, but it also can be kind of a stressor on the animal when they're not able to select. They've got to eat what's in front of them. They'll adapt to it, but it's not necessarily what's in the best mindset of that animal sometime. So think about that. And then the last part on that freedoms deal is freedom from fear and distress. And you talked to a bunch of cattlemen about fear and distress. What creates fear in an animal? It's mostly, in real life, it's a predator, right? Or predator movements or actions. So in the case of domesticated animal, who's the predator? That would be us, right? If we don't do things right, we can create fear and stress in animals. And I think that's kind of where we come back to what the title of this here is, how do we handle those cattle to where we don't elicit this fear response in them? And Kurt and I both are adamant about this. We don't ever want to elicit a predator-prey relationship with a cow. If they see us as a predator, that's stressful. And I've seen some people that look like predators when they're working cows. And I had there was a guy in Mississippi sent me a picture one time, and this young man was working Red Angus cattle, which are some of the gentlest cattle in the world. But he was sweat just pouring off of him. He had a hot shot in both hands. And Sammy said, I think maybe this boy's a candidate for one of your schools. And the cattle were all looking back at him like trying to get away from him. And I can't find that picture, and it drives me nuts. We were talking earlier about trying to put together presentations, and that's one picture I can't find, and I know I've got it somewhere. But being able to keep that cow in a thinking, responsive mode. And if we understand how to ask cattle to do something, we can get them to do a lot for us without a whole lot of stress. So that's where we get to thinking about how do we interact with them to get them to understand what we want to do without forcing them to do it. If I get you to thinking about wanting to do something, even though it may be a little hard on you, it's normally not as stressful. If I make you do something, think about your kids. When you make them do something, how stressful is it to them? Some of y'all remember back that far, can't you, how stressful it was? But it's interesting to think about the mindset on an animal, and we don't normally worry about that a lot of times, but really that mindset of that animal can change very quickly. And when we do, we go to burning up energy in a fear response that could be used for growth. Now, we're getting a little deep in the weeds there, right? We just want to get them where they work pretty nice. But in the process, we can actually help those cattle gain better, have better health, and that's something we don't think about a whole lot. Sometimes the impact we have on the health of an animal by the way we handle them as well. So I think that's something to consider in that process, but I think the nutrition is important. That's one of the bigger stressors. We got to have enough in there. How many of you on fescue? Nearly everybody in here, right? Kind of hard to get away from fescue in this part of the world. We don't even have fescue in our part of the world. We tried to grow it, and it won't grow in our part of the world. And so it all droughts out and dies out, and we don't have that issue. So a lot of us don't even understand the issues around the stress related with fescue, summer heat, that kind of stuff. But trying to make sure that we have cattle that can tolerate that, respond to it, and handle the heat, whether we have to manage differently to get that done, I'll leave that to other people to talk about that know more about it. But creating that environment in which we have cattle that can perform the way we want to. And that whole gain aspect on the cow-calf operation, a lot of times it's not a measure of gain necessarily, it's reproductive performance. Are your cows getting bred up at a high enough rate? You having enough body condition on them so they'll cycle and rebreed, maintain pregnancies, all these other things that come into the nutritional side of it. Now when you're growing cattle out, of course the gain is important and critical to the survival of that aspect of it. The health aspect as well. And I'm kind of going down these, I switched from the freedom concept to what they call the 5 domains of animal welfare. Nutrition is number 1. How our management of the environment is number 2. And number 3 is this aspect of health. We got to keep them in good health. How many of you have more health problems now than you used to in cattle? Let's be honest. That actually we have more sickness rates in cattle, higher sickness rates in cattle now than we ever have had. We've got better animal health products. We have better nutrition. We have, quote unquote, better genetics, but we still have more sickness. That's kind of the question that keeps popping up. What are we doing different now than we used to? One, there's getting to be less genetic variation and hybridization within cattle. Anybody in here own a purebred dog? That's a dangerous question to ask a bunch of country folks because most of us don't. We own the dog that showed up a lot of times, right? Are those the dogs, which ones do you have to take to the vet more often? If we all had purebred dogs, we'd keep a lot of small animal vets in practice. If you've got an old mutt, how often do you have to take them to the vet? Very seldom. They have less health issues. Better immune systems, they're stronger, all sorts of things help manage the health on that. As we've gotten our cattle more and more unmongrelized, I guess we could say, we're getting more health issues in cattle. So crossbreeding is another one of those things that we can help manage the stress of the health side of it in our grazing systems or in our cattle systems in general. So keep that in mind as well as if you're having some issues on health. I think parasitism is the same thing. We're now starting to see cattle that have heart disease. Isn't that interesting? Cattle that have heart disease. Guess what genetics those go back to?
So does over-medication help or hinder?
Over-medication? Probably. I think we're over-medicating to some extent. Over-vaccinating to some extent. We did some work, the feedlot trial years ago, and the people that actually vaccinated their cattle more often, and we're talking about respiratory disease, if they were vaccinated more than 3 times, they actually had more health issues. And we've got a lot of cattle now going through these systems that are having 5 and 6 shots for viral respiratory, and they're having more sickness. It's not surprising to me. I think we need to get a better system in place to where we actually communicate. And a lot of times we communicate what was done, but if somebody tells you they did something, how many of you trust them that they did it right? Right? So we're paying, it's interesting to me, we'll pay more money for a value-added calf and then still vaccinating. Maybe we need a better system and better implementation of what we have. I think we can over-deworm cattle in areas. We've seen some places, particularly south of here, back in the where I'm more in tune with, I guess, the coastal states, where they've dewormed those cattle, particularly stocker cattle, quite often, and they wound up having a bunch of them die of parasites. They were killing off the ones that competed with the other ones, and they lost their balance in nature, and the cattle actually died of one they weren't treating for. And so we have to really have these programs lined out and not just repeat doing the same thing over and over again. Expect a different result. Isn't that the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? So I do think we really need to look at our management systems, and that's a great point. Are we overdoing some things? I think we're overdoing on minerals and some other stuff as well. I think you got to have a good mineral program, but there's a lot of things being done that I don't think are absolutely necessary on the cattle side of it to have good nutrition and good health in cattle. The other one is, kind of another domain is this behavior deal we talked about earlier. So are they able to act like cattle? And most of the time they can. That's one of the best things about the cattle industry. Most of the time we manage in external environments, let's say. So cattle can express their normal behavior. You think about chickens, swine, it's kind of hard for chicken or swine to really do all they need to do inside a hutch, right? So cattle, for the most part, are in pretty good shape. Now, what about confinement feeding operations? Anybody in here do confinement feeding in addition to grazing? A lot of people do. They'll have a confinement operation, have a grazing operation, and allow to use the manure and the compost out of this one to fertilize this one. Not a bad deal, but once again, are we creating stress and changes in behavior when we do that? And then we get back to the last one of those domains is this mental state, and that comes back on us. So if we talk about how we handle cattle to reduce stress, and that's kind of where we're circling back around here, in a grazing system, you can get cattle really gentle, right? And they'll come to you really easy because you open the gate and they want to come to you. So grazing systems can actually improve cattle interaction and cattle handling, but I also see it somewhat like a dairy. They get so used to this routine, when you change the routine, they freak out. I don't know if y'all have ever tried to work dairy cows to get them out of the routine. They just cannot handle that. And so that's something to think about, is maybe we need to work on how we handle them as we rotate them. So as they come to the gate, I see a lot of videos, everybody loves to post videos, they open the gate and all their cattle run to the next paddock. That just drives me crazy. I don't want them running over all that forage. I want them to ease in there and start grazing. And so to stop that behavior, when they start coming, you've got to slow the motion down. Or all motion builds motion, right? And so they'll run halfway across the field before they can get their head down and go to grazing. So honestly, when I open the gate, I want to let them come through and stop them. ease through and stop them. Slow that motion down where they don't run through. That also teaches them to respect your position. If you just open the gate and let them run past you every time, they learn to run past you. So we create bad behavior sometimes by the way we rotate cattle in a grazing system. Now, all of us, that allows us to really do a good job of getting cattle to come to us, but it doesn't necessarily teach them how to be worked once we get them in confined situations. So when we take them out of the routine of going paddock to paddock or pasture to pasture, however you want to call it, and get them into the working facilities to do these processes we may not all need to be doing, but we need to run them through the processing chute. That can be stressful, doesn't have to be. There's a whole, I get tickled. There's a whole cottage industry that's developed on selling signs about how bad we are interacting with family and working cattle. Y'all have noticed that? 96% of farm divorces are because they work cattle together and stuff like that. They're selling T-shirts and mugs because we can't get along in the cow pen. If working cattle causes you that much stress, what do you think it's doing to the cattle? Because what's happening to you is happening in the cattle. They sense that kind of stress. They're very receptive to that. So if we can't get along in the process of doing it, we're stressing our cattle out. That aspect of working cattle is it should be one of the most fun things we do. If we don't enjoy working cattle, why are we in the cattle business? There's a whole lot better jobs around that don't let you get mad at your job. I'll say that, maybe not. We all get mad at our jobs every once in a while. But being able to process cattle, get them to do whatever we want to, the load out, the whole aspect of that. And I'm going to see if this young man back here let me borrow his water bottle. I thought this was the only room I'd ever been in that didn't have a water bottle in it. Can I borrow your water bottle for just a minute? When you don't have slides, that's a cow, by the way. I look like a big fat cow. Little bitty head, big shoulders. Get behind it, you can't see the bottle cap, can you? So if we work cattle from the backside, they can't see what we're asking them to do. Because all of our communication through sight or sound is on the bottle cap. So we have to be where we can see the bottle cap or they can't see us. Kind of like the truck going down the road. If I can't see you, or you can't see me, I can't see you. So we communicate with cattle through sight. And so now we're going to get into this handling aspect of this. If we have to position ourselves more to the side or the front so they can see us and know what we're asking them to do. Now, those of you that are a little older, how easy is it for you to turn your head around and see what's happening behind you? I now have to shift in my seat to see what's happening behind me, right? So older cattle or fatter cattle get to where they can't see as well either. And so we have to position ourselves further around. Any kind of motion or action back here, they're going to turn to look at us. If we're wanting them to go that way, then we got to put more force on them to turn them back around and run them away from us. So we can work on getting over here, creating a draw and sending cattle forward. Now Dasani's messing my deal up here. Normally these things have a strip of paper right up here. Dasani's about the only one that doesn't. And that's called a point of balance. I use that as an indication of point of balance. So if that point of balance is up here about the shoulder, that means when you get behind that, the cattle go forward. You get in front of it, you stop them, or they'll go away from you. All right, so that makes sense to a cow. And that's kind of where, there's anything about the shoulder that make an animal do anything? There's no sensory organ there, is there? So the point of balance is not a static point on an animal. When you go past about that point, you get out of focus in their eye and they'll move forward so they can try to focus on you again. They'll normally get out here and turn. Once again, counterproductive, right? If we're sorting cattle and we have to go past the point of balance to get them to go past us, that'll create too much draw. The ones behind them will get biased before we can stop them. So part of what we do in the cattle handling side of it is change this point of balance. And a lot of things will affect that. Whether you got cattle in front of them or some other pressure point up here, you may have to it'll change where the balance point is. But we'd like to shift that balance point out here in front. That way we can draw cattle to us and we don't have to go behind them to push them. As you start working on that, it gets kind of fun to see how far out in front you can get it, because you can really shift that. Now, if you've got them in a lead up to a chute or something like that, about the time you pass that point is when they'll move forward. And that's where that whole diagram that shows the point of balance at the shoulder came from Dr. Grandin. That was her experience. When you walk past cattle in a lead up to a knock box or processing chute, that's when they'll move forward. But we can change that. It's just like drawing cattle out of a paddock, right? You open the gate, they all come to you. If they don't, then if one of them won't come past you, they don't trust you. And so that's a good indicator. If a cattle will not draw to you and come past you, why do they not trust you? So that's a good indicator to kind of see where we're at from that standpoint. So that's, keep my cow in mind. I don't want this young man to starve to death here. Freedom from thirst and hunger. Thanks, sir. So now we can remember our water bottle. But that's a pretty good visual in my mind to think about. We're always trying to communicate with that front 4 inches of a cow through sight and sound. How many of you think about and focus on pushing the body somewhere? That rarely works very well. What we need to do is draw the mind somewhere and because wherever the head goes, the cow goes. So our job is to get it pointed in the right direction, put pressure on them, and get them to go somewhere. That's how we can start reducing pressure. It makes sense to them if they can see us out front, know what we're asking, and respond to it. So when you go home, a lot of you probably already been doing some of this, but try to use that concept, one, to stop movement. I talk about them when they come in through a gate, to stop them. How do you stop cattle? We'll just talk about that right now. If cattle are coming at you, what's the best way to stop them? Most of them will kind of go to them, put pressure on them. Actually, the best way to stop them is to back up. Let them slow their feet down, get their mind stopped out in front of you. If you go to them, it puts pressure. That's a drawing pressure that pushes them past you. Kind of opposite of what we think. But think about that, sorting cattle in an alleyway. How many people have been run over in an alleyway going, yeah. Back the heck up. Take pressure off. Let them think, have room to think between where the pressure is and where they're at. Totally opposite of what we normally do. Because we're so, particularly men, we're nuts. We're going to stop them, right? Anybody ever stopped a cow? There's been a lot of people run over by cows, but not very many of them stopped. And you can get them, you whack them in the head, they'll turn around. But the thing about doing that is if you do it enough, they get to where they won't come by you. And then you lose that draw. Because they learn, once again, you snap somebody on the nose enough, they'll get to where they won't come to you. So think about that as well as how we draw those cattle into what we want them to do. And think about everything we do with a cow in the processing side, moving, loading, whatever it is, we need them to come to us and past us. Y'all ever thought about that? They're going into a squeeze chute. They got to come past somebody. Going up a loading chute, they have to go past somebody. So everything we do, we want them to come by us. That's where grazing systems kind of help. When we're rotating, we teach them to come by us. But when we get them in the processing areas, a lot of times we start pushing them. And it's counterintuitive to them then to start working from behind. So think about that when you're working. A lot of you probably already do some things that way. But if you're having to take and force and push cattle through a system, once again, work from the front, try to draw them through it. Sorting in our business is where we make a lot of money as well. And so being able to sort cows and calves is another place I think we have a lot of stress in some operations. Sorting cows and calves should be easy, but it's amazing how many times I see people really struggle with getting cattle sorted. And I don't mean to, by the way, if any of this sounds like I'm attacking you personally, I don't have any idea how any of you work cattle. So it's not you personally I'm talking about. But always sort cows off calves. Don't sort calves off cows. Always send them past where you want them to end up. Let the cows flow back and hold the calves somewhere. I don't know, how many of you have seen this they call it two-stage weaning deal that comes out of Saskatchewan, Canada. They've actually got creep gates where they let the cows go one way and the calves go into another pen through these creep gates or under the gate. Those work, but you don't really teach the calf how to handle. He just happens to go under the gate. And so you still need to take time to train them to respond to pressure too. What I like about sorting cows and calves, we let the cows by, I can teach the calf to stop, I can teach him to turn and go a different direction. So that's a really good training exercise on the calves. If you keep it all slow, and then, boy, in our part of the world, sorting cattle is a sporting event on some places. And they try to see how many cattle they can run over the poor guy in the gate and let him still be successful. If that happens, I'm going to throw a hissy fit, because that's not what needs to be going on. That needs to be a slow process, slow and steady, so you're not having to redo everything. And you're trying to train cattle in the process. And it doesn't take a whole lot of people to do that. There'll be one or two cows that may stay back in the calves, but it's always easier to put them somewhere with the calves and then pull them off later. So many people get so hung up on getting those last ones out that it creates a lot of stress in the whole deal. So trying to get flow and draw, once you get cows down in another lot, the rest of the cows want to go to them. Now, if it takes too long, those cows are going to start coming back, right? So we've got a system at home when we let the cows out into the bottom lot, the calves we send off to the side, and it kind of helps hold the cows on that side of the gate. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that way you have an opening for the rest of them to get out. So sorting cattle is a big deal. I think sorting calves for shipping is the same thing. And if you haven't done much sorting on them, they get to where they don't want to come by you in an alleyway. So what we actually try to get people to do is, before you really start the sorting process, is just walk down the side and let them flow by you twice without stopping them. A lot of people, well, they'll run over you. No, they won't. Not if you'll back off, as you need to stop one of them. But you can teach them it's okay to come by you, then it gets real easy to sort. Where it gets hard to sort cattle is when you've got to go too deep in the herd to get one of them to come out. So keep that in mind as well when we're talking about how we get cattle to move forward. And that whole process there trains them to also go up chutes better. And by the way, we have a YouTube channel if anybody wants to kind of see some of our clinics. Called Ranch TV. I don't know if anybody's ever seen our YouTube channel called Ranch TV at Texas A&M. We've got about 1,600 educational videos up on that. One of the playlists is actually on cattle handling and stockmanship, and I think there might be something on there you could find useful. I've done 3 clinics, and they're up there in their entirety, so some of them are broken into segments, but they're up there. I think some people find them helpful anyway in what we're talking about here. But trying to get cattle where we can also keep them as a grouping. Y'all ever have any herd quitters? Normally in a grazing system, you don't have cattle to run off and go in the brush. Any of y'all have any cattle like to brush up? There's normally a few of them around, right? If you have cattle that don't want to stay with the herd, here's something else you can do because getting them back in the herd sometimes is stressful on that one and the rest of the herd. If you got one of them that wants to leave the herd, even if it's yearling cattle or stocker cattle or whatever it might be, if you'll push them away from the herd until they want to go back and then let them think they're getting away with it, and they'll learn to go back to the herd, that's where there's low pressure. They think getting out of the herd is where they can remove pressure. So when they leave the herd, go put pressure on them best you can away from the herd, and eventually they're going to want to get around you and go back. If you do that a couple of times, those cows get to where they won't leave the herd. or calves get to where they won't leave the herd. And so that's a good way, if you, particularly in these smaller confined grazing deals. Now, if you got a fence jumper, be careful about how much pressure you put away. They can just keep going. But in that scenario, you've got to learn when and where to try that. But reason I ask how many of you get stocker cattle in and purchase cattle, they all come from different groups, don't they? And so they don't normally act as a herd. And so you can build that herd instinct by actually separating groups and making it more comfortable for them to come back together. So we can create a herd mentality. If you've got a group of them that goes off and leaves the bulk of them, do the same thing. Put pressure on them over here, let them learn to come back to the herd and take pressure off. So you can create that grazing unit to where they don't splinter as bad once you get them all together. So we can use a little psychology on these cattle to get them to where they want to stay as a herd and graze as a herd. And there's another guy named Bob Kinford in our part of the world, and by all accounts, Bob's crazy, but he does some pretty good work. I give Bob fits. He's out in West Texas, and he has a deal called instinctive migratory grazing. I don't know if y'all have even seen any of his videos. But he creates this herd instinct out in large landscapes where they're not fencing. And so they can create grazing groups and place them in areas where they need to graze. That's something very different than what we do over here where we fence them where they need to. But in those large landscapes, you can actually create that herd mentality, place them on good forage and leave them, and they'll go to water, come back to the same spot day after day until they graze it out. So there's a whole lot of mentality we can use in manipulating cattle to get them to where they do that. And so in these small confined deals where we're using fencing, we don't necessarily have to do that. But if you do have some larger paddocks that they're not grazing, that would be a good place to put pressure on them where they want to graze, and the release of pressure is where you want them to graze. That make any sense? We do the same thing. If they want to stay here, we harass them here, but we leave them alone over here. And if we want to take them to a place and get them to graze, sometimes you can get movement started, and movement in cattle will just continue until we stop it or they hit a fence, right? But if we want to stop them short, we can walk up their side, because going up the side of an animal slows their movement or stops them. So if we've got our herd going this way, we go faster than they are, we'll stop them. And so if you can't start, stop, and turn animals either direction, and I'll challenge you and you go home, try that. Start, stop, and turn one either direction on command. That's a pretty good exercise. And you think everybody can do that. We'll go in college labs that I teach down there in stockmanship, that's the one thing I try to do. Just go out there and start, stop, and turn that one back and forth both ways. 90% of them can't do it the first time. And so it's somewhat humbling when you realize it's not that easy to get that kind of control on them. But that's what your goal is, to get where you can start, stop, turn them, either push them away from you or draw them to you. Either way. So when we get cattle where we can do that, we can put them anywhere. But back to my placing them in the grazing situation, if you take them somewhere, stop them, and then leave them there, then they're all facing the same direction, they'll take off again. So to place cattle on grazing or feed of any kind, and we'll back up and talk about putting them on a bunk, we have to change the orientation of some of them. You want some facing one way, some facing the other, and that'll kind of hold the group there. That sounds pretty simple, and it is. But if you have everything facing the same direction, if you'll ever notice, a group of cattle will actually leave every time if they're all facing the same direction. They may all graze the same direction. So if we can change that dynamic, we can slow the grazing pattern down and place them in an area. Same thing if we're trying to move them toward the crowd. We want to hold them somewhere. You can do the same thing. So keep that in mind. How many of you do feed cattle on a bunk? Anybody in here? Some of you do. A lot of people will push cattle to a bunk. When they get to the bunk, a lot of them will turn around and look at you. So the deal is to push them away from the bunk, let them turn around and go back to the bunk. And when they get to the bunk, then they're facing where you want them to. But if you put pressure on them from behind, remember what I said on the water bottle, they can't see you. You push them up to where they can't stop, they're going to turn and look at you. And so if you do get them started, you either got to stop back here where you don't put too much pressure on them at the bunk, or push them away from it and let their motion take them to the bunk. Getting cattle on feed is not that hard, but a lot of people really struggle with it. I was out in Oregon a few years ago, and they were talking, these cattle had come off the Parker Ranch. And I don't know if y'all have ever been around the Parker Ranch cattle or even heard about them, but they're pretty wild. They may be a big outfit, but they're kind of goofy. And so they have to really work with those cattle to get them on bunk. They're real in tune to looking at people, kind of like a wild deer. And so we were talking about getting them on feed, and they said, these cattle we can't get on feed. And there was 3 people out in front of the bunk, horseback, telling me how they couldn't get these cattle on feed. And I went in the pen, and I pushed them to the back of the pen. They turned around, and they were still telling me they couldn't get them on feed, and every one of them had their head in the bunk. And they hadn't even noticed what had happened. And so, I think you really have to, I had to stop and said, would y'all look at what, right, y'all telling me they won't get their head in the bunk, and they're all got their head in the bunk. But they were standing there in front of them telling me it wouldn't work. So I know it will work. It's kind of interesting to see. Getting them on water is another one. If you're bringing cattle in, if you're raising your own, it's not a big deal. But in our area, we get a lot of cattle that don't even know what a water trough is. And so that's something we have to teach them how to drink out of water troughs and get them to go there to get that done. The process, go back to the stressors in livestock handling. The biggest stressor in most cattle's life is when we get them in our smaller environment. So we have them in our paddocks. They can take the flight zone. We can talk about the water bottle. There's always an area around the water bottle where you get too close, the animal will move, right? In grazing systems, sometimes that gets pretty small and they won't move from you. So you do want to keep some flight zone in cattle, because if not, you wind up getting them too gentle and get too close to them. Then you have to put more pressure on them to get them to go do something. So managing flight zone gets to be the last thing we'll kind of talk about. But if cattle are out in a grazing environment, normally their flight zone's pretty moderate. But if we get them in smaller corrals, crowd pens, single file alleyways, and then a squeeze chute, that kind of ramps up the stress level, right? And so getting them comfortable in different, more confined settings is important. So I bet most of you don't have a big issue with that. But if you have cattle that really get stirred up in the pens, why are they getting stirred up? They don't feel the ability to release pressure. And so we see that all the time in cattle. We get them in smaller and smaller confinement. They get to where they can't mentally take pressure off. It's kind of like me moving to town. There's no release of pressure, and so you want to get back to the country as quick as you can. Same thing on cattle. You get them in confinement and you keep them long enough, sometimes they just get stressed out. And so we need to get them through a system pretty quick. Don't let them fret like that. But 2, always put pressure on cattle when they have a way to take it off. So if you put cattle in a crowd pen, they need to be able to get out of the crowd pen immediately. That make sense? Because I see people that will warehouse cattle in a crowd pen trying to get them into the chute. That needs to be a flow-through part of the system. Because if not, they get in there and they just go to turn in circles. So we don't ever want to leave cattle in a sweep tub. It's going to be interesting to see what our facility design looks like. We talk about in retrofitting old facilities. I love doing that. But it's amazing how hard it is to make them work sometimes. I always wonder what in the world was in somebody's mind when they built that facility to start with. So it's interesting to kind of see how we can build designs. Anybody in here use bud boxes? Anybody even know what a bud box is? Got one guy, 2, 3, 4. Bud boxes are, if you're good at handling stock, they work pretty good. If not, they're just another nuisance. You got to learn to work cattle pretty easy. And if cattle will flow around you, a bud box works really good. Now, how many of you don't even know what a bud box is? Okay, there's where a slide would help. All right, gotta get creative. This is my bud box. So if my alley come into my chute or loadout was right here, I would put cattle in here, they would turn around and come back out. Okay, that kind of makes sense to an animal. You take them past where they want to go, you get over here, the cattle come around you and out the chute. I have a publication I call Cattle Handling Pointers, and there's 5 things I want to try to get everybody to think about. Cattle want to be able to see you, they want to go around you, they're going to follow one another, they're going to release pressure, and they can only think about one main thought at a time. Okay? Cattle, and I started to say you could search it on the internet. They just redid our website at A&M. We can't find anything ourselves. I've got a paper on designing a bud box and this cattle handling pointers, and neither one of them are there anymore, so I don't know where they went. So we're trying to get that fixed. But those 5 things, they want to be able to see you, go around you. And why do they go around you? So they can see you. As they start around, they're turning their head. That way they can keep an eye on you. That's why a bud box works. You put cattle in here, get on this side, put pressure on them away from where you want them to go. They flow around you. They can see you. They can follow one another. It's releasing pressure, and they can think their way out of it. That's why those 5 principles work really good in a bud box. Now, what about a sweep tub? How many of you have some kind of sweep system? That's normal for a lot of people to put in some kind of sweep. Now, there's 90-degree sweeps, there's 180-degree sweeps, there's 210-degree sweeps, and there are about 900 versions of all that. The ones Dr. Temple Grandin didn't talk about are 270-degree sweeps, and I may be getting into the presentation on facilities, but cattle come in to the tub and make a circle and come back out. Kind of looks like a bud box, doesn't it? So a properly designed sweep system does exactly the same thing as a bud box. What we've done, we've built them where we bring them in here and want them to come out here or over here. And it's not a flow back system. And so in those situations, if I'm sending cattle in here and I want them to come up here, I still have to stay on this side to get the cattle to come around the sweep and not turn back on me. Okay? Because we can use that to push on an eye and get them to come out the top of that crowd tub. And we can talk more about that if anybody has questions as well. I'm getting we're supposed to 9:30 when we're supposed to. All right. If anybody has any questions or arguments, we'll get that recorded too. Don't mind them. Remember, I'm going to record you, so don't be nice. Anybody have any questions about handling or reducing stress or some issues you run into? We can use this as therapy session if nothing else.
So if they're all facing one direction, how do you get them to face opposite direction? Could you repeat the question?
His question was, if they're all facing the same direction, how do you get them some of them to reorient where they're not all facing the same direction? That comes into, you'll find one of them, you can get pressure on an eye, and remember I said turn them away from you? If you can turn them back in the herd, and you just sit there and it's just a chess match at that point in time. Just find a few of them and turn them back into the herd, and you got to be careful. If you do it too fast, they'll all start going the other way, and you lose all your momentum. So then you can walk, if you get some of them, you get too much motion coming this way, you got to walk up their side, stop them, reorient them. So it's just a matter of poking on eyes until they, not literally, but pushing on an eye with pressure, get that bottle cap to turn around either to you or away from you. If you can get them to go away from you, and I keep mentioning that, why is away from you better? We'll say better. If a cow trusts you, they'll turn their butt to you. If they don't trust you, they will always turn and look at you as they turn around. So if they trust you and you can push on an eye and they'll turn their butt to you and turn around, they'll stay there. But if they don't trust you and they turn this way, they may want to leave. And so that's why getting to where you can push on an eye, get them to switch eyes and pick you up on the other side, that they trust you. and they'll do nearly anything. So that's my key indicator on a set of cattle, if I've got them where they'll work for me, is if I can turn them away from me without them looking at me. And that sounds easy, but when you first start doing it, just pay attention. You put pressure on cattle, they'll back up and turn towards you. So then you've got to keep forward motion in them. It's no, you may hear train horses. It's no different than training horses. To make one of them turn right, you've got to have forward motion. You see these reining horses spin all the time. They've got forward motion in that spin. Everybody thinks they're sitting on their butt, but you've got to have them going forward to do it right. Same thing on a cow. So we've got to get them going forward and turn. Now the other reason to do that, how many times cows can stick their head in a corner and not want to come out? One, they don't know what you're asking. They don't understand the pressure. But if I can get one of them where I can push on that eye and send them down the fence, they'll turn the whole group out of the corner. So that's a really good tool. Get start, stop, turn them both directions. And what I said earlier. You had a question?
Yeah, if you're moving a group of cattle that were used to being together, and it seems like you always have one that's a little bit more flighty, and she wants to take off across the field in the opposite direction that the rest are going. What's the best way to respond? Do you ignore that single animal and just take the rest of them? What would you do?
That's a great question. If you're moving cattle and one of them wants to go back or run away from the herd because the flight zone's different, bigger flight zone or more fearful, and there are those differences in cattle. In nearly every herd that occurs. Whatever you do, don't chase it. Don't, because that just reinforces their fear. So the best thing you can do is try to ignore it. And if that doesn't work, then just go to them slow and put pressure on them away from the herd, like I talked about earlier. That way they'll learn that he's not going to chase me, but he is going to put pressure on me back here. So it's going to be better. You may have to do that 2 or 3 times, but just be very consistent in it. I always liken this one to, if you chase them, it's kind of like grabbing your spouse and telling them to calm down. Does that work very good? Doesn't work very good, right? So we got to do something different. We got a little reverse psychology there. Give them time to start thinking where the herd is, and if they don't come back, then you can put pressure on them away from the herd. Good question. Got one back here, had his hand up, and then I'll get you. Okay. Well, the question was, if going back to what I said about slowing them down as they enter a new paddock, do you need more people? I would probably use a flag or 2 flags if I was by myself, to where I could spread myself out, be 2 or 3 people kind of deal. But the thing is, as soon as movement starts, you stop it. Then you let it progress a little bit, you stop it. And you just let them inch in and hold. Pretty soon you can back off and they'll start moving slower. If they speed up, slow it. Some of that's going to depend on how your gates are set up as to how well you can do it. You can start that process before they come through the gate. That way they're not as apt to get away from you. And so as they start toward the gate, stop them. And cow-calf pairs is another one where a lot of really good grazers won't let a cow come through the gate unless she has a calf with her. Doesn't have to be hers necessarily. She got to have a calf. Because sometimes you're not pairing them up that much. But make sure a lot of times you slow them down, they got a calf, they can go. Pretty soon they'll learn to get their calf and you'll let them go to the new paddock. So there's a lot of things we can do to train cows coming through. Because it irritates me to no end for a cow to leave her calf in the back of the paddock. So the other thing you can do is to go to the back of the paddock, get everything up, get the cows to come back and get their calves, and then start the move. So a lot of times we'll start the move before we get everything paired up and ready to go. But that answer your question? All right. On line bred? Okay. The question was, what's my thoughts on line breeding? If it works, it's good. If it doesn't, it's inbreeding. And that's the whole definition of line breeding. If you don't show up with genetic defects, then you got line breeding. If you do, it's inbreeding. So if you've got a really clean set of genetics, you can really fix that genetics in that set of cattle, and then they outcross extremely good. And that's where some of the old Hereford lines, they were so line bred that when you crossed them, you got a great hybrid kick. And so to some extent it works, but it's the best thing about it, it will identify any genetic defects real quick, which is not always a bad thing, because we've got a lot of genetic defects in a lot of cattle right now. We need to get out of them. And so some line breeding might not be a bad idea, or we can identify them quicker. Now with genomic testing, we can find a lot of that stuff easier, but still some of it won't show up till they're 3 or 4 years old, particularly foot problems, that we could probably identify much quicker through some breeding program.
So I'll just finish up. Can I ask one question?
Yes.
So when we graze stockpile tall fescue, or we're doing bale grazing, we're giving those animals a small strip of rationing that forage out, giving them a small strip of the back fence. They're pretty eager when you take that front fence down. How do you slow them down? It's one thing if you're opening the gate and you can kind of slow them down going through the gate, but when you're pulling a fence down and you've got 60 or 80 cows standing there wanting to go to the next strip, how do you slow them down when you're doing that without getting run over?
If you're pulling the whole fence down, it's probably not going to work very well to try to slow them down. If you drop the fence or roll it up, they're going to move the next fence. How big an area are you talking about there? Some of those strips are not very big, so to me it's not as big as Dill is running. Yeah, and that's where I like the real deals where you can actually roll them over and let them slowly take into a new paddock.
Oh, the tumble wheel?
Yeah, and so if that's a real issue for you, I'd look at some of that kind of technology to where you could slow them down if they're just trampling. The other part is, are we waiting too long to move them?
Well, I wanted it cleaned up.
You want it cleaned up. But this is where, and then Lewis and I had this conversation last night, is our focus on the cattle or the forage, or can we get both and have it right? If they're too hungry and too eager, we've probably gone too long. Not this is a bad thing, but we may want to adjust it. And there are times when we may use, I'm going to say there's times we can abuse a pasture, and there's times we can, quote unquote, abuse a cow. We can't continually do it. And so if that's a continual problem you have, then I think you need to reevaluate your grazing. That's just my opinion.
Jesse, you had a quick comment on that?
On Chris's question, the way we do it, or I do it anyhow, is instead of, I presume you're using a brake wire with a wheel. Instead of winding the brake wire up, unhook and walk into the new brake away from the cows and let them follow. They'll start eating without.
It mimics the real kind of system.
Tension on the fence so it doesn't
Right.
fall down.
Yeah.
They can't cross the fence. And once you're on a 90-degree from your brake wire, you can start holding it up.
Anything to slow that, just don't drop the fence and go all at once. That's kind of,
We need to, one more quick thing here. Go ahead.
You talked about in-state cattle. Is there any advantage to keeping a well-behaved old boss cow?
the question was whether there was any advantage to keeping a well-behaved old boss cow to help train other cattle. In some cases, maybe. If they're earning their keep, if that's all I've got them around for, no. But if they're still a productive cow and still serving that purpose, I'd probably keep them around. I know some people use old lead steers or whatever to train cattle. In most cases, I don't think it's necessary. But if you've got one, they're still productive, still doing good, or you've got them named, just keep them. Okay, that's the big side of that deal. If we ever name them, they're probably going to be around longer than they should.